Local Public Sector Alliance. This is an open knowledge sharing platform for practitioners, policymakers, students, researchers, anyone interested, like all of you here, on the subject of decentralization, localization, multi-level governance in general. We maintain decentralization.net as an open platform and really encourage especially young researchers to contribute and share your learnings. By way of introduction, I am Madhavi Rajadhyaksha. I lead the governance practice for Abt Global, which is a mission-driven international development organization. I am joined here by Rachna Sreshta, who is a public management specialist with the Asian Development Bank, and Peter Yates, an associate director with the Asia Foundation, who co-chair the Asia Expert Working Group with me. As all of you know, we are here for a very, very interesting discussion. It has been a volatile, dynamic time in Asian politics. And we're very lucky to be joined here today by speakers from very many countries. How we're going to structure the next 90 minutes is we're going to have a brief overview from every country expert about the latest political shifts in their country and what that means for decentralization and local governance in general. We're just then going to have a bit of a facilitated discussion before we go into a Q&A. We want to try and make this as interactive and open as possible. So please do feel free to drop an introduction in the chat. You can leave your questions in the chat as well. We'll try and pick up as many as we can during the discussion. And if not, we'll pick it up towards the last half an hour in the Q&A session. I'm going to introduce Dr. Pallavi Roy, who has very kindly agreed to moderate the session for us. Dr. Roy is a professor in political economy at the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. She's currently a co-director of an FCDO anti-corruption evidence research partnership, which works in Bangladesh and Nigeria, and is also a co-principal investigator on an FCDO-funded program on generating evidence for inclusive growth in Nepal. So really looking forward to learning from all of you and listening in. Over to you, Pallavi.
Thank you, Madhavi, for the introduction, and thank you to the audience for joining. Good evening, afternoon, and perhaps good morning, but it's probably evening and afternoon for most of you out there. We have a really interesting panel that covers most of the large countries in South Asia. We will also have, where possible from the audience, we look for, I can see some colleagues from Nepal. We will encourage you to also say some relevant things about the interesting developments in terms of decentralization in Nepal. We'll weave all of that into the conversation. But first, what I would like to do is invite our panelists to introduce themselves and lay the base for the discussion that we will have. And maybe, Madhavi said that we are really looking at contemporary developments. I don't think we can get more contemporary than what's unfolding in front of our eyes in Bangladesh. So maybe Farha, if I may, I will call on you to give a brief introduction. And then if you could just provide an overview of, the political shifts that have happened. We even had elections in January. So just focus on these developments and how you think the decentralization process will be panning out. Now, we will be having more specific questions on these topics as we go forward in the facilitated round, but just good to have a quick heads up from all of you for 5 minutes. Farha, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you, everyone, and greetings from Dhaka. As we say, July Revolution, Autumn Revolution, and the rebirth. But basically, it feels like there is a huge transition from a particular governance and culture and practice that we experience over 15 years. We were very Bangladesh, like many other countries in South Asia, is stuck, or globally stuck between a two-party system. And we have one party ousting the other party. And there's a practice of electoral democracy since 1991 in various, like 50 shades of gray, because it's not the democracy, the gray that I want, but there's been different shades of it. So interestingly, what happened in July, which is known as the July Revolution, the Bloody July, was students' movement that had a demand to end an affirmative measure or a quota system, which was designed for the veterans and of 1971 Liberation War, but was being, continuing for the children and the children's children. So this is for government jobs, and the students from public universities who would compete for these jobs felt highly disadvantaged, discriminated. So it started with an anti-quota, anti-discrimination movement by the students. And like many autocratic governments who feel that they can address some of these issues through the show of power, have not learned from history and were ousted. Despite very, very negative, very huge demonstration of power by August 5th, from July 15 to August 5th, with the loss of many lives, young lives, students, children, vendors, rickshaw pullers, we now have what we call a new Bangladesh. And it's very busy trying to address the issues and complexities left over 15 years. Every institution that you can think of in terms of governance has been corrupted, has become partisan. And in this period, whether it's the judiciary, the executive, the legislature, none of the systems and the bureaucracy, the civil service, every nook and corner of the country has become very partisan. And this effort to make it distributed among the cronies and the supporters of a particular party, a lot of people were sidelined, were pushed, and law and order situation, and using the law enforcing agency to sustain the government has led to major violations of human rights. Now, we do have electoral democracy. Every 5 years there was elections. So if you want to talk about electoral democracy, in theory, in paper, we have had elections every 5 years. Are they acceptable? Was it participatory? No. And in fact, in January, when the elections were, the major opposition party could not participate or did not choose to participate because they felt that it was not fair and square, and it was violent. And also, people didn't participate. I didn't vote, and I'm a conscious voter. So, and the young people, the first time voters, also with all their enthusiasm, went to the voting centers and found out that their votes were already stolen or they didn't get the opportunity. So that is the background in which the students' movement happened. But because of the show of power and the killing of innocent people, the whole middle class, public university, private universities, vendors, rich, everyone came on the streets. And so it became a one demand movement for the ousting of the prime minister. And now, interestingly, we have an arrangement which was agreed by civil society and the student. Experts are now running the country. We have Dr. Yunus, who's known to the whole world, the Nobel laureate, and he's the chief advisor. And if you look at the panel of advisors, there are more PhDs per, among them, and all experts. So there's a lot of hope. But what has also happened is there is vendetta and vengeance because of the pent-up suppression oppression, which is manifested in different places and different ways. And then there is also everybody that has not been able to speak out or have an opinion or preferences, are now trying to kind of come together, and they feel that if you can protest in Shahbag and you can get your agenda fulfilled. So I really can feel the stress of our advisors. Now, they have a number of issues to deal with. One of them is, of course, the law and order, restoration of the institutions, bringing in qualified people, the economy, first and foremost, because there was a lot of corruption, and the previous government took away money, printed money. There was, it's a labor. You can build numerous PhDs around how these institutions were corrupted or what happened in Bangladesh. So they do have a handful, and it is a new government. I mean, it's a new arrangement, and we have student leaders for the first time. So that is one scenario. The other is that the deep, deep level of corruption, the partisan behavior in the institutions cannot be changed overnight. And how do we get out of these harmful practices that exist? So we do have gender discrimination, culturally, politically, socially accepted. We do have ethnic and religious, discrimination, because we have the Chittagong Hill tracts and Bengali versus indigenous. All those issues will have to be dealt with. We do have small religious minorities. Some of them can be identified with a particular political party. They did face some issues, but at the same time, there's a huge effort to ensure that we don't lose this opportunity, because this is second chance for us. So we all have to come together.
Thanks, Farah. That was not easy, putting in 15 years of politics condensed into 5 minutes. But thank you very much. We move to Marcus, who will tell us a little about Myanmar, very different from the Bangladeshi situation. Bangladesh has exploded in popular anger. We are seeing some kind of synthesis going on right now. Myanmar, the events are still unfolding very interestingly, and Marcus has a good view of that. Marcus, over to you in terms of doing the scene setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will try to be brief and focus on the specific issue of local governance. But of course, we need to set the scene when we speak about Myanmar, and recall that on the 1st of February 21, the military took power in a military coup, which it nevertheless tried to present as constitutional conduct, as in terms of following state of emergency provisions. And paradoxically, the military maintains this constitutional fiction that it is still operating under the 2008 constitution, which it itself imposed 15 years earlier. That is easy to dismiss if you just read the words written in the constitution, but it is a significant fact, because it allows the military to spin a narrative of having to redo an election, specifically the 2020 November elections that took place across Myanmar in 95% of all townships, which resulted in the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, winning 80% of the electable seats. This is a result the military didn't like and wanted to overturn, and this eventually came up with very facetious allegations of electoral fraud, and simply detained the head of state of Myanmar and the state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, and they remain in incommunicado detention in Naypyidaw. No country has formally, legally recognized the military junta to be the government of Myanmar, but de facto, all of Myanmar's neighboring countries and ASEAN are essentially interacting with the military junta as if it was the government of Myanmar. Now, I should say that I work for International IDEA, which is an intergovernmental organization based in Stockholm, Sweden, with 35 member states around the world, and we have had a relationship with Myanmar government institutions for more than a decade, and we remain committed to working with only the legitimate counterparts, meaning the elected parliament and the national unity government that has been formed on that basis. So we have no relationship with the military authorities in Naypyidaw, and all the programming that we do, including at the local level, is going through the legitimate interim institutions that are now operating on the basis of the Federal Democracy Charter, which is something like an interim constitution the Democratic Resistance Forces, including the parliament, adopted in early 22. So that is sort of a bit of background on where we're coming from. What is also, of course, significant to understand is that the military has not only not been legally recognized, but has also not been able to establish effective control across the territory, and has in fact lost more than 2/3 of the territory of Myanmar, and is now reduced to basically a fragile, brittle control by force over the central plains in which the big cities are located, Mandalay and Yangon. But as we speak, Mandalay is as close to falling to the democratic resistance as it has ever been. This is the worst moment in the Myanmar military's history. It has never looked so weak. It has completely lost the legitimacy among the population, and it has basically no way out. The Democratic Resistance Forces, on the other hand, are more united than ever. They are quite diverse and maybe have different approaches over many things, but they all agree that the military regime has to go and needs to be replaced by an entirely democratic civilian government based on the will of the people. And the current movement, which is very much driven and energized by a popular rebellion, you can say, similar actually to what we just saw in Bangladesh, that simply refused to accept military rule. I think the difference is that what the previous Bangladesh authorities started with, which is to kill people at random on the streets. This is what the military in Naypyidaw got away with, because that's exactly what they have been doing, and they have been able to intimidate the urban population and detain thousands, kill hundreds, and it has been essentially waging a war against the people of Myanmar for the past 3.5 years. A war that it has been losing, especially since last year. What the Democratic Resistance Forces have been doing is not only focusing on overcoming the military regime, but, and now it becomes interesting for this conversation, also rebuilding the country into a federal democracy, fully based on principles of non-discrimination, of inclusion, of the rule of law, of democracy at all levels. And that includes also a complete overhaul of the state-society relationship and a reconfiguration of the state structure with a very strong emphasis on bottom-up democracy, on a federal system that is strongly based on regional and local identity, at least to reflect the diversity in the population without at the same time creating new divisions, and a completely reconfigured role of the central state. So this state building process that is going on, and both in debate, but also already in practice in the liberated areas, which are now more than 60% of the country, also includes, of course, the key question of what kind of local government is Myanmar going to see. And there we see, I want to just say a few key points that are important. One is that Myanmar has, as a result of decades of military dictatorship since 1962, essentially missed the train globally when it comes to establishing local government. It is one of the very few countries that has never actually had local government in the sense of an autonomous, elected, locally representative entity of the state structure that exercises certain autonomy over its own local business, and also is sort of course, embedded in central state structures. What it has instead is a purely deconcentrated form of central state government, and that would be better described as local administration. And that actually goes back even to British colonial times, but even in the 1960s and 70s, when India and Bangladesh and other countries and Nepal introduced local government and have actually come quite far in that regard, Myanmar has completely missed that development and is basically starting with a backlog of decades of capacity development, structural development, etc. On the good side is that this current war situation in many parts of the country has forced local communities to take matters into their own hands, and there has been a lot of improvisation and local adjustment. The elected MPs that all come from specific constituencies do play a role in different degrees and in different ways. This is something one could talk about separately, because they are the only ones who can claim to be elected representatives of certain local communities, but they were, of course, not elected as local representatives, but as members of parliament, of the union parliament, and of the state and region parliaments. But they do play a role in some local areas. And the challenge that we see at the moment is that we see the national unity government, which is essentially partially an exile government, but partially also working from inside the country, is trying to pull the governance structures together, but is trying to also not follow the same mistakes as previous centralized unitary governments that basically just ruled all the way down autocratically to the local level, but is trying to provide some space for local autonomy and improvisation. And so that is what the national unity government has been faced with, and it has played out in very different ways in different parts of the country. So there is no single way of describing local government at the moment in Myanmar.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. We will be going, diving deeper into some of the points that you've just outlined later in the session. But thank you for that overview. And may I now call on Shireen to give her view, because she works at the level of the donors. She can also provide that perspective. Over to you, Shireen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pallavi, and good morning, good afternoon, the audiences. I'm Shireen. I've been in this human rights field and governance field almost more than 15 years now. And I think Farapa already at the beginning said quite a good thing for what happened, what happened recently in Bangladesh, that we are calling a revolution, and then a new opportunity to rebuild the country. Just to add with Farapa a bit more on that, in the July Revolution and after the collapse of the former government, I mean, what we have seen at New Bangladesh, which the movement started from a quota reform to anti-discrimination. That's a shift, like from where it started and how it went to from a simple education or job quota to anti-discrimination, then a regime change. So you see the shift. And then involvement of the students, then the youth, then the mass people, then the family and all the middle class, everyone came out. And from central, it was mostly Dhaka University central based movement. But later this, because we are very much talking about decentralization here, so it started at the central level, but then this whole movement, from everywhere, people started joining. So which was really interesting, and also like what led this movement happen, because what Farapa was mentioning, that we did not have the voting rights. I mean, that was very important. I mean, despite all the development work done, or all the infrastructure is being done in Bangladesh, which we appreciate that has been done. But the biggest challenge was like we didn't have a democratic practice, freedom of expression was curtailed, and the voting, people, even last time in election, people didn't want to go to vote. So earlier it used to be like they used to go to vote and your vote is casted. But the last time what we have seen, even that government trying to bring people to come to the center, but they failed. And that also was reflected in the local government election, where the previous government was trying their hard to bring people to come in the voting center. So when the people they lose their interest in voting, they lose their interest in going to institutions, because all the institutions were destroyed, corrupted. So it's not only the corruption about the political parties or leaders, but the huge corruption by the administration, by the institutions. So there was no kind of faith on judiciary. People won't go to judiciary to file cases or go to police to make complaint. I think for any country, it's quite alarming actually when the institutions are destroyed. So that, and that ongoing inflation, people cannot speak. So I think this all of these things, big corruption, freedom of lack of democracy and everything, there's a huge kind of, I would say that when you have no space, this is like kind of pressure cooker. It's everything like then burst together. So that's what we have seen. It was led by definitely student and youth, and generally all the people join. And now I would probably I will take 1 or 2 minutes to come to the decentralized point in Bangladesh, as it's one of the key purpose of this meeting. In Bangladesh, I mean, officially we have this local governance system in structure. Structure is very much in place. But the challenge is, what in my experience or what we have seen is this local governance government act or laws that gives establish the structure. But when we talk about the decentralization, what does it actually mean? Do they have the capacity to decide, to make plan, to have their budget, or like that sort of decentralization? I don't think that it was practiced here. So we had some good example in some cases in Bangladesh. We have seen that local governance was very successful, like in terms of flooding, in terms of kind of crisis management, COVID response. But the true decentralization, that was always, I don't think that we have seen that very much in the last, I would say, after the independence. So it's not about last 15 years, it also before that. So that has been a struggle for Bangladesh for since its birth, and also like the true spirit of democratic practices, and also like when you talk about human rights principles. So that is also missing from not only the local level but from national to local level. So that is something like in the next part, if I have chance, I would like to talk about that. What are the challenges with the new opportunity that we have, whether we can take it or it become more worse. So that is something we need to be careful, and we also need to, to understand the situation and to look at the opportunity and the challenges. So I'll leave it now for the others. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Yes, you will definitely have an opportunity, as we discussed earlier, especially how the power of the youth and how you can harness them going forward. That's something we look forward to from hearing from you. If I may now, I will move to Mujib in Pakistan, where Pakistan has had its share of local protests, nationwide protests, elections that have been very contested, again at a very interesting cusp in its history. So for Mujib to lay out the foundations of where these changes have affected decentralization. Mujib, thanks.
Thank you, Pallavi. Thanks very much. So yes, starting with the introducing myself, I'm just trying to be true to So I'm Mujib Khan. I'm a senior principal consultant for Oxford Policy Management. I work in the governance practice, and I'm managing one of our large program, subnational governance program. And that is what gives me this privilege of having deeper insights into what goes on in the local government level. But in terms of broadly setting the scene in Pakistan, as you would be aware, has been muddling through crisis to crisis, particularly both at the political level as well as on the economic front. Uh, we have had a formally hybrid system of governance where military was a formal participant in the decision making process, though it had a facade of a political system in the 1985 under Ziaul-Haq's the then government, when they introduced a constitutional amendment called the 8th Constitutional Amendment, which gave formal powers to the president to actually dismiss the government if he or she thought that the government is not being run in line with the constitution. So that practice continued for a number of years, and subsequently we had about 4 or 5 different political governments coming in and going, and each one of them, unfortunately, having to be dismissed by the succession of presidents throughout the 90s. Then we had a literal coup in 1999 when military took over, and there was they didn't call it a martial law, but the chief of army staff called himself chief executive officer. But in a couple of years' time, he formally assumed the office of the president. Incidentally, he was the one who actually introduced the most effective local government system in Pakistan. I mean, it wasn't done, with good intentions. Of course, he wanted a proxy system to be laid out at a level below the federation and the province, which would be beholden to him. Unfortunately, since he didn't have the democratic consensus about that system, despite being a very good system, it was bound up when the political governments started coming back. And then we have had again 2 political governments, one led by the PPP, Pakistan People's Party, of the former, late Bhutto and late Benazir Bhutto. Their performance, obviously, it was accused of a lot of corruption, mismanagement, and they were voted out. So that was, I think, the first time ever in Pakistan when a political government completed their 5 year tenure. So they were voted out, and then we had another government by the Pakistan Muslim League (PMLN), Nawaz, led by the then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. And again, his government was bundled out through judicial decision, which many thought was an engineered decision, was not a correct decision. And he had to leave, and an interim government came in, and then we had the government of Imran Khan for the next 3-4 years, which was also then ousted through a political process. But it's widely believed, that these were the props that had been supported by the defense establishment. Those props were taken away, and then the political process took its course, and the government was removed. And we had a government led by Pakistan Democratic Movement, which was a coalition which ruled for about 5-6 years. That was the time of 5-6 months. That was the time when Pakistan was passing through a very difficult economic phase, and they had to agree certain arrangements with the International Monetary Fund, so a standby agreement, and that was successfully delivered, followed by an interim government, because Pakistan has this peculiar arrangement where you have, as per the constitution, a caretaker government that comes in at the conclusion of the outgoing government to make sure that the elections are fair and they are not interfered with by either the outgoing or someone else. But in reality, what has been happening is, unfortunately, that the interim governments are also come with particular intentions, are brought in with particular mandate, and that is because of the role of the defense establishment. So we had a constitutional amendment again going back to 2010 called the 18th Constitutional Amendment that actually purged the constitution of the military-led constitutional provisions that enable them to have that formal role of dismissing governments should they, if they thought that the government was not being run in line with the constitution. But I think just after a few years, the things started going back in the same direction. So, from being a formal hybrid government, Pakistan, in my view, has come to be an informal hybrid government. So there is a significant influence that the army plays within the decision making. So we had elections in February this year, And new governments have come in at the federal level as well as in all the 4 provinces. I was just having a look at their manifestos. The PMLN, the Pakistan Muslim League government, which is ruling the Punjab province, had the most elaborate reference to the local governance and how they would reform the local government system. Other political governments had also made brief references to that, including the PTI. PTI is Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, led by the Imran Khan, his party, who is currently incarcerated. And his party rules in one of the provinces called KP, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. While the PTI government spoke hugely about the importance of local governance, but in terms of practice, I think they have significantly fallen short. In that province, we have the elected local governments in place for the last, I think, 2.5 years, but they have not been given any funds at all. So they are just there in name. The elected officials are there. They have no funds. They have been protesting against their own government, but they have not been able to receive funds and deliver the local mandate that they have. And delivery of services at the local level is being done through the deconcentrated offices of the appointed civil servants, the deputy commissioners and assistant commissioners. I think one of the other critical issue with the local governance in the KP province, which is ruled by the PTI government, is the non-existence of the elected tier at the district level. So, it's a federal government. Pakistan has a federation, 4 provinces, and the local government is the 3rd tier. And typically, each of the province has a district level elected tier, and then a tehsil or a taluka level tier, and then at the grassroots level, union councils, etc. The PTI government in KP did away with the district tier. So, in my view, there is a constitutional provision which mandates the provincial governments to have elected local governments. So they don't have an elected government at the district level, and the reason for that was because the district is a bigger entity, and the mayor or the chairman or a chairperson of that entity is perceived to be a countervailing force to the elected representative to the provincial assembly or even the national assembly, and that is why they wanted to do away with that tier. So currently they have a tehsil level tier, which is sub-district tier, and a local tier, and even that is not fully empowered. Coming to Punjab, where the PMLN government that had the huge section in their manifesto that will be holding elections and there'll be elected governments. There have not been any local government elections there too. I mean, it's early days. They are trying to revamp the Local Government Act. That's the other practice that has been going on in Pakistan. Typically, the government comes and they want to change the local government law. So currently they are doing that, but they in the past have also not known to be pro-local government. They like to control things at the provincial level. And again, example, there would be 2 things that they have done. One is the basic education and the basic health have been taken away from the mandate of the local government. So they have now autonomous district health authority and district education authority. So whatever little is left to the local governments, for instance, solid waste management. So unfortunately, the government decided to in Punjab to have these larger contracts to deliver local government services at the provincial level. So while the mandate is local, but the provincial government has advertised and asked for different firms to bid so that they could give them the contract out the function of solid waste management at those levels. So that's current. So in essence, the local government is not there. In some places they do exist, but that's mostly shallow and hollow. Except for Karachi and Quetta, there are 2 capital cities in Sindh and Balochistan province where you could call them to be somewhat in operation, the elected officials. The rest of the country is either local governments are there but not empowered, or they don't exist at all. So from local government point of view, the situation is not encouraging at all.
Thanks again, Mujib, for that roundup. Over to you, Rahul. Before we start the more facilitated part of the conversation, what has been your experience? India remains this sort of chessboard of many kinds of governments, many tiers of governments. What does the recent election mean for the recent central elections? What does it mean for local governments? Your views and thoughts. Thank you.
Pallavi, and thank you, everyone. So let me give you a brief picture of Indian politics, the snapshot. So since independence 1947 and the first election started in 1952, you could roughly divide Indian politics at the national level in 4 phases. You had the first phase from 1952 to 67, when Congress party used to win elections both at the national level as well as in most states. From 67 onwards till 1989, you could see that as a second phase where Congress party won elections at the national level, but it had started facing opposition and in some places losing elections at the state level. In that period, we also had a 2-year sort of like national emergency between 1975 and 77. Then from 1989 to 2014 is known as a period of coalition governments, where you saw no single party getting majority at the national level and multiple parties came to form the government. There were times when BJP under Prime Minister Vajpayee formed government, which was known as NDA coalitions. And then you had UPA coalitions where Congress under the Prime Ministership of Manmohan Singh had 2 terms of government between 2004 and 14. And the fourth phase, which has begun with the rise of Prime Minister Modi at the national center stage, where BJP managed to get a single party majority in 2014 and in 2019. In 2024, they were expected to come back to power. They did come back, but they received a serious setback. I think the elections that happened in the month of April and May, and the results came on June 4. By February, March, the expectations were that BJP is roughly going to get a very similar number or higher number compared to the past. But they did receive a serious setback. In the sort of like, this sort of like 4 phases, if you want to think in terms of like the economic story, the 90s is a period when a lot of things are happening. Of course, India opened up its market, the liberalization happened, and since then, economic growth and reforms have been fairly modest. But there is like while a large number of people have been able to come out of poverty, you have a very high number which is still dependent on the state for their welfare. And it's the same time in 1992, what India did had what is known as 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, which is related to decentralization. So before that, we had sort of like system of local governments, meaning at the village level or in cities or in districts, but there was no constitutional backing to it. And so some states used to hold them in time, some states didn't used to hold them time. So 73rd, 74th Amendment from 1992, now there is a constitutional mandate. So every 5th year, you at least have elections at local level in most states. They might get delayed here and there by a couple of months. But first thing which is to underline, both at the national and state level as well as local level, elections happen and there is very high level of participation. That 73rd, 74th Amendment is also very important because what it did, it created a very radical affirmative action architecture vis-a-vis local self-government. And so what in India we started with is reservation for historically marginalized communities in most states, and 33% reservations, so 33% seats were reserved for women at all levels in local self-government, which now in most states is at 50% level. And so you are getting like half of these elected politicians are women. There are problems with that, but I'm happy to sort of like go into detail later on. So elections are happening, participation level are great. We still don't see a pipeline in terms of like people who are getting elected at the local level reaching to the parliament, right? And so what's happening is that every level seems to be confined at its own sort of level. Second thing, which is very important, and I just want to link the political developments of last 15, 20 years vis-a-vis what's happening at the decentralization thing. So in some ways, what we did see in last 10 years and even before that, and this is like both an effect of a political party and prime minister coming to power with absolute majority, but also sort of like technology coming into picture in how welfare delivery is being done. And this model, which like I would say like is visible in India, I think is happening in many parts of the globe. And so what is happening? I think there is a centralization of political power that's happening at the national level. And that centralization of political power is happening around a personality cult, which is basically giving rise to two things. There is decline in trust in institutions of democracy, but it's also giving rise to populist sentiments, because in many parts of the globe, what seems to be happening that politicians have managed to sort of like persuade, and they only would have succeeded if a large majority of voters were feeling that the state and its institutions have been sort of like captured for vested political and economic interests. So it gave rise to populist sentiments. So what you are witnessing in India, as well as in many parts of the globe, where you are seeing rise of technocratic political system, which is trying to cater to a populist sentiment using the levers of the state. And so on one hand, and this is the paradox of our time, which is on one hand that welfare delivery is becoming more and more efficient because of use of technology and usage of these local government. But on the other hand, what it is doing, because this welfare delivery is being thought, planned, and organized at the national level, these institutions of decentralization are actually now being used to re-centralize political power, right? And so this is happening because of like a new kind of politics and technology getting sort of like mixed up. The third thing, which is again sort of like linked to both politics at the national and state level, but also at the local level. In 1990s of India, when you're seeing rise of state level parties, so we have like hundreds of parties that contest elections, some 40 or 50 reached parliament. This sort of like fragmentation of political power in some ways is linked to various kind of identities and story of their empowerment and trying to get a seat at the table. But that period is also marked by sort of like what I'll say as negative things within the electoral political system, where you are seeing people with greater wealth or money, people with alleged criminal sort of like records are getting and winning into office. And this is now getting replicated even at the local level. And so during my PhD fieldwork, I noticed like for even village level elections with 5,000 people, candidates are spending large sums of money to win these elections. Of course, there is ROI on that kind of investment through corruption and other kind of things, but it's also a matter of sort of like social prestige and perhaps using this as a lever to gain more political power. So deficiencies of national and state politics is now becoming much more visible in local politics. And so in that sense, I think the very motive where local governments are going to become centers of like direct governance and more accountability is perhaps getting a check from these negative sentiments on power. Fourth, I think, again, it's not an India-centric problem, but I study India, so I know this a little bit more compared to, I think, like the old dictum, which is decentralization for thee, but not for me, is very much visible. So everyone argues in favor of decentralization when they want other to devolve power, but when they have to do it themselves, that doesn't seem to be happening. And so I think Mujib Bhai touched upon this when he spoke about funds, functions, functionaries. In Indian case, because now there is a constitutional mandate that you have to devolve 29 functions to these local government, there is a great variation. And I think in India, that in that sense also offers us a model to study what has gone right and what has gone wrong. Because local government laws are made at the state level, different states have followed very different trajectory, not in just in terms of nomenclature, but in some states, political parties can contest on that symbol. In other cases, political parties are barred from contesting. In some cases, local government elections are direct, where you elect the chairperson directly. In other places, they are indirect, where sort of ward members elect the chairperson. So I think
Rahul, sorry, we just need to hurry up a little bit. Sorry about that.
yes. Well, just last point, and I'll finish there. So I think what seems to be happening, that while on the electoral political front things are going great, but I think both in terms of devolution, great meaning okayish, but on the devolution front, which is funds, function, and functionaries, we still have lots of challenges. And finally, I think when we think of decentralization, and perhaps this can come up during discussion, I think we have to understand in South Asia the way urbanization has happened, which is very, very lopsided. We need to discuss urban and rural decentralization in a very, very different context. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. What I'll try and do, I have this unenviable job of synthesizing what has been said, and also put in a few points, because this is a very fascinating discussion, I think, for all of us here. I think what we were listening to across the panelists is essentially a sort of exposition of what is real effective decentralization in terms of political representation, in terms of decision making, in all these years that we've been working on it. Is this something that we've achieved, through waves of populism, through waves of authoritarianism, through waves of half-functioning democracy, as Farah very interestingly said? She said shades of gray for democracy. So I think, Farah's point about shades of gray for democracy, despite the so-called electoral democracy, there weren't acceptable levels of participatory political decision-making, not just at the levels of Dhaka, but also in the Upajilas and in the local governments. In the Bangladeshi case, something that Shireen said chimed very well with what Farah said. Her point was people simply lost interest because they saw that the institutions had become completely discredited in an authoritarian system. So it was always going to have a knock-on effect on local governments and how people respond to local government elections, because they don't have trust in the political system or the institutions that have been, not really built up, but actually have been eaten away at. And we'll be discussing more of this in the facilitated discussion that's coming. So it doesn't matter what the authoritarian regime does and however powerful it might have been in the first few years of its existence, it did not have any kind of salutary effect on local government participation. Mujib, I was actually going to bring up General Ayub Khan's basic democracy and his, 80,000 odd basic Democrats who were directly elected. And you very correctly said it. This was literally going over the heads of the other opposition parties, which at that time was, Muhammad Ali Jinnah's sister. And this was really to stall opposition there. And this was in the 1950s and 60s. But if you think about it, a lot of decentralization in South Asia has actually been used for those purposes. And we don't have a panelist from Nepal, but we do a lot of work in Nepal. And really, that's also something that we see coming out very interestingly in Nepal. Just what I find very interesting about the language of decentralization there was initially you had to speak of spheres. You had to say the federal sphere, the provincial sphere, and the local government sphere. And now we've kind of defaulted to the mean of local levels, which gives you an idea of where the normative aim was and where we've gone in terms of the very realist processes as to what local government actually now has started to mean. And increasingly, we also see in Nepal that the federal government wants to tighten its grip on the local government at the expense of provincial governments. And this is not something that's just, limited to South Asia, because I also do a lot of work in Nigeria. This is exactly what's been going on in Nigeria right now. The president is trying to loosen control of political control that the governments have over local governments. And this has to do with budgets also, and is trying to do local government reforms that bypass provincial or state governors. So decentralization at the heart of it is a very, very political process, but because we forget that what drives implementation is actually the distribution of power and capabilities, and not just at the local level. You can have an authoritarian government or a competitive clientelist democracy in the spectrum of shades of grays of democracy. But what happens at the federal level, the central level, will have a knock-on effect at the local level too. It's not possible, I think, for us to divorce that. Rahul made some really interesting points, and I think as somebody who also studies women, female representation, the point that you made about panchayats, Rahul, that you don't see a pipeline, whether it's women or indeed, other actors in the local politics, you don't see that pipeline moving forward into even the state assembly. We don't see that movement actually happening. I think the other very important takeaway, and this is a conversation that Madhavi and I were having earlier, is technology. And that whole cycle of technology, central technocratic governance, leading to more populism, leading to contradictorily efficient service delivery, but losing hope in the actual, I would say, the actual potential of decentralization delivering to people politically. So it's a very, very contradictory, if you might want to say, vicious circle. But I thought Marcus's intervention and exposition really gave us a lot to chew on, and we'll come back to this, Marcus, later, which is, this is a country with no historical legacy of local self-government, and it's almost like a social experiment now, where the general administrative areas are not the ones in power. There's also this very interesting trade-off here between, so what is the formal rule here, what is legitimate and what is not, and where do donors come in, which is again something that's increasingly relevant in spheres of decentralization. So rebuilding of the country from the local level using informal networks, and then will we see a formalization of these informal practices? What is the interplay of formal and informal? And I think here in Myanmar, we are actually seeing, in some senses, a positive way, how the distribution of power informally works, because we do have constitutions, mandates which are formal, but they're often in contradiction and indeed contestation with how the informal power networks actually interrelate. And we're often told that the failure of decentralization is because decentralization hasn't gone far enough. But how I would see it is because decentralization has only now begun to look at how informal networks interact with what the formal rules system of rules is, and how to make best bridge that gap in enforcement between how informal politics works, how power is distributed really, and how formal rules actually say power should be distributed. I'm going to keep it at that because we have some very, very interesting questions to talk about here. So I'm going to bring in Farah again. And this whole point that was raised again by both Farah and Shireen, which is that, faced with increasingly authoritarian regimes, donors and practitioners of decentralization in the civil society space have realized that they cannot work with the opposition, and then they are left to work with the authoritarian regimes. And this is something that we really saw in Bangladesh, in the hope that at some level, central authoritarianism can be bypassed. You can work directly at the local level. But we've seen that this has not been successful. So how effective do you think this is for genuine decentralization, Farah? We can see that when a regime has been in place for 15 years, you really don't have an option. But you also see that this has been a miserable failure. What then are the trade-offs and options that donors are faced with? Thanks.
Before I come to the recent time, I just want to take a little step backward. We had the Ershad regime, a military turned president, and he wanted to decentralize, and he took up a project on Upazila and decentralization. And, he wanted to decentralize the judiciary, the other arms of the government, as well as health sector and so on. But his decentralization project, the infrastructure part of it picked up because he could do that. But the human, social, other aspects of it didn't work. Doctors went on strike. They refused to go and work in the health complexes. Lawyers were not so, lawyers were probably more interested to have, Upazila level courts and so on. but doctors, teachers. So the center has such a magnet that it pulls everybody into that. And the whole concept is, it's colonial. We have the colonial heritage. All the South Asian countries, the India Act of 1935 is the basis, and then you talked about basic democracy. That is also part of what has influenced our local government. So if you see, Bangladesh had from 1991 significant, attempts on local government. We have the Act of 1997, the Zila Porishad Act of 98 and 2000. And on one level, there is a success story because Bangladesh, on many of its indicators, outdid its South Asian neighbors, right? And this happened even when there was still centralization, but immunization project success was because it went so well at the local level. Some of the poverty was brought down from 40% to 25%. Literacy rate reached. So those indicators, just taken on the surface, can demonstrate that even in such a centralized way, there were changes and local government did work. And there was investment from donors. There have been hundreds and hundreds of projects for decentralization. One of the best examples is the rural electrification program. I think that is a star project in Bangladesh, where rural electrification through the Rural Electrification Board reached the public as a service, as a technology. It went, and we achieved our MDG goals, and all that happened. But if you go a little deeper, participation, voice, all that remains questionable. We were influenced by the Panchayati Raj, and I was one of the advocates. I went to India, learned, came back, did the advocacy for women. So we got the reforms. There's now 3 seats for women. There was election for women. But the culture and the practice in the political parties did not change. And therefore, it remains centralized. The political parties do not have democracy and they do not practice. So it's dynastic politics. On top of that, there's very strong centralization. And then there is an exclusion agenda. So what we did is we started working with the community and with the people on the ground. We went down to the union level. We educated them on their budget, governance, literacy, and we could see the changes happening. So there are multiple examples, Bangladesh being a laboratory, where you will find these local government initiatives working. And they were working fine until this regime came and they started making local election party-based. So again, we had another round of partisan and centralized behavior. And so before no one went to the election based on any of the symbols. They were based on what they did at the ground level, and they were known for their activities on the ground. So local people elected them, which is why even when there's such strong resistance to Jamaat Islami, there were candidates, independent candidates, who managed to win local elections because of their performance, their connection with the people on the ground, and so on. So, but in the last 15 years, they have also made that multiple experiments, made the local government elections party-based with party nominations. Then again, last year, this year, when the local elections, they again dropped the. So people are in a bit of a confusion, and the trust deficit is huge. But on social projects, whether it is for stopping child marriage, whether it is about climate change, all those investments have paid back. Now, on the back of these successes, the government is going around the world saying, we are very good in disaster management, we are very good in XYZ, but those achievements have come at the back of the commitments and engagement of the community. So I hope in 2024, we can raise these and can bring that change as a part of the nation building. I'll stop there. Because one thing I don't know if everyone understands, but even our village has a population of 100,000. If you come to the Upazila, we have a population of 250,000. So you have to think, this city where I am, we have a population of 20 million, which is the population of 3 or 4 countries in Europe, 4 different governments, 4 different administrations, 4 different budget. So trying to cope with something of this scale is mind-boggling, is extremely challenging.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Farah. Rahul, I will pull you in now. Given your extensive experience of working with decentralized politics and decentralization in India, what would be the key challenges right now, given the landscape, the political landscape that you just laid out? And from a decision-making perspective, how far can service delivery be actually devolved before it starts becoming less effective? And while you can obviously will be bringing in your India perspective here, some of this also comes from our experience of working on the 3 spheres of government in Nepal, really, where the local governments have a lot of independence in areas like health delivery, health care delivery, and education, and also to an extent industrialization. But given the fact that there are so many, sometimes coordination does become a problem. And so at what point does devolution start becoming ineffective? Is there any good example? Obviously there are there's no hard and fast and black and white rule to this, but what's a rule of thumb depending on the context? Thanks, Rahul. And anything else I think actually helps you answer this question.
Thank you, Pallavi, for that question. I don't think I have a good answer to that question, because this question in itself is at the heart of like 300-year-old debate on how much to decentralize and whether not to decentralize. That was the question when American Constitution was being written and thought about. So to me, I think first thing, what seems to be happening in India, that these local government at the village level are the sort of like key points through which welfare is being delivered. And now, like earlier, they used to play a greater role in selection of beneficiaries, meaning like creating those lists and passing up higher the ladder. But and there you used to see development of patronage and clientelistic politics of all variety. What seems to be happening with this, like when I'm saying technology, it's basically most governments have now adopting to sort of like direct cash transfers rather than giving different kind of public-private goods. And this cash transfers in some ways is taking away whatever sort of like it's solving one problem, which is basically intermediaries taking a cut from those transfers, because those transfers are happening now by one click of button from Mumbai or Delhi. It takes away that kind of power which intermediaries had earlier. But in that sense, it's also breaking down sort of like political structures and political parties at the bottom level, right? Like now, a political mobilization is less likely to happen through a vertical machine where party leaders are connected by state leaders and then district level and then local level workers. Those mobilizations are much more happening via internet, via social media, and like around the face. So in that sense, it's also sort of like weakening the power of local intermediaries, which in some cases are important. And I'm not sort of like trying to make a point that, these intermediaries necessarily need to be there. They serve some important and good functions, and they also are also sources of corruption in the system. I think what I want to sort of like make the final point and end here, in certain cases, what we have seen that welfare delivery model through this local government has worked better in comparison to others. And that depends both, one, the level of devolution that has happened at the state level, and especially whether these sort of like local government have power to generate resources or able to collect taxes, right? Some kind of taxes. So wherever there is more sort of like resources available at the local level, they are also able to perform more functions, and especially because of those resources, they're able to hire functionaries at the local level. Wherever the ability to sort of like collect funds are lower, there you have a very different kind of problem. And so in that sense, if you just want to draw a map of India, you would see a very different picture, like South versus North. And just to give you one sort of like example, so I did one sort of study on what is known as in India at rural level, panchayat secretaries. These are basically executive officer at the panchayat level. Now, in southern part of India, each panchayat has one on an average panchayat secretary. Whereas when you come to the north, in places like UP and Bihar, which are much more populous, one panchayat secretary is serving 5 or 6 panchayats. Yes, the panchayat sizes and the population sizes differ, but if one person is responsible for 6 or 7 such places, his or her ability to perform even basic functions. And one basic function of panchayat secretary is to record birth and death registration. That also gets affected in a situation like this. So I think, I don't know what the equilibrium would be, but if these local governments have ability to raise resources for themselves, they will be much more effective as an sort of like platforms.
Thanks so much, Rahul, for this. And I'll just very quickly add to something that you said, that the point about raising resources becomes very important. What we've done in our research actually at the local government level in Nepal is we've actually done some power mapping of, what the mayors, and the mayors are very important in the local government setup in Nepal. And what we've really done is track transactions that these mayors have been doing and what have been the outcomes? Have they been developmental? Have they been extractive? And what we've seen is that informal transactions really matter, and they're more damaging where the power configurations create incentives for extractive strategies, especially if mayors have a short-term time horizon. So time horizon matters. A lot of the money games that we see at the state levels, and in Nepal, certainly at the federal level, we are now beginning to see mirrored at the local government level also. So what is essentially happening is that, devolution of power is extremely necessary, but, some of the less developed areas where you need more attention by donors, these are actually much more susceptible to greater extraction. So you do need a kind of, at least an informally within donors, a sort of hierarchy of which are the regions, and in a very spatially unequal, demographically unequal in terms of incomes, geography like Nepal, these kinds of considerations as to where and how power is configured actually starts becoming very important when you study decentralization. So it's no longer something technical that, this is what the constitution says, these are the 3 areas that have been parsed up between the 3 spheres of government, but some need more handholding, more intervention, some because of the momentum that was already there, the urban areas that we see in Nepal up and coming will already start moving forward. So I think that there is also something to be said in that, but we can talk about that later in the Q&A session. I want to move to one area that we talk about a lot in terms of governance, but which has been, more or less reduced to a buzzword, except for when we saw this happening, this incredible uprising, the monsoon uprising in Bangladesh with the students. And I'll bring Shireen in here to answer this. What was really amazing is that Gen Z coined this term that we will not let July end till the Sheikh Hasina regime is actually sent out of the country. So a lot of the youngsters and a lot of the social media posts that were being allowed to come out at that point in time actually said, well, things continue till the 36th of July, not the 5th or the 6th of August, because we are not ending this month till the regime actually packs up and leaves. So we've actually seen what youth power means, and it does seem to us from the outside that this was spontaneous, this was organic. How do you think we've missed a trick, Shireen, in terms of harnessing youth power, and what would this mean going forward for the opportunities that Bangladesh has to resurrect? Farah talked about the fact that there have been successes, but how do you then add this very successful mobilization to decentralization efforts in Bangladesh? Shireen, thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. I think it's a very, one of my interest area is like youth engagement and how this youth, because with this Gen Z, we normally complain like, okay, they're so much into technology, so much into my cell phone and everything. So there was like for Bangladesh, I think it was for a kind of waking up call for us, like to see that we whom we see that okay, there is no hope with this generation because they don't care about the country. And then when we saw like this the huge how it has turned up. So I would say that okay, from the development partners perspective or civil society perspective, there for last few years we have been trying to engage with the youth in different forms, like sometimes it's with youth engagement with the governance program, or the like sometimes like sectoral program like climate and the other child marriage, and these different ways that youth were engaged. But as you said, it was not always been successful in many cases. So in Bangladesh, we have seen like this again, there is a lot of contribution from the CSOs, NGOs, and the development partners, I would say, on the youth engagement in terms of this child marriage, and then also like the dealing with the climate and disaster. That sort of we had success, but on the democratic practices, especially on the decentralization, I wouldn't say that there was that much strong engagement with the youth from CSO or NGO side, because they did not have interest in this side. That was our experience. But I think where this movement, what is my realization is like, um, it has shown us like we actually fail to understand how these young people they think, their way of thinking, like that is kind of failure for both for I would say CSOs, NGOs, development partners, government, even the political parties, like how they think and what they need actually. And that's where I would say that all the actors were failed to engage the youth for last many decades. So and this movement has shown that still there is hope, and we should engage with the youth. So that is the learning, I would say. And also coming to another point, like on the decentralization part, like that I have missed in the first part of my speech, the decentralization, the donor's perspective, or like when there was a very little space for governance work, democratic governance work in Bangladesh. For example, my experience in Bangladesh, there have been many discussion. Shall we leave this place? How under the authoritarian regime? Why? Where and how should we engage? Then many of us, we actually push for like, okay, we still think that the local governance, the decentralized space is there. There is still a space where you can engage. You can work with the different groups, informal groups. So that's where like, working on issues with the formal sector, but also the informal players, like you can engage with the communities, you can engage with the youth, you can engage with the different other actors, where in reality it was difficult to act to work with opposition or like other political parties. You could not people who had different voices, it was really difficult to work with them in a formal forum. So we had to devise a strategy like how you engage with those groups. So I would say that Bangladesh case, that could be a learning for development partners and CSOs, that in a fragile context or in an authoritarian regime, because Bangladesh is not only one country. There in all over the world we see this the rise of the authoritarian regime, and then how actually this development work or like human rights work can be done and in which level. So for Bangladesh, I would say that's the success, that we continue to engage at the local level, continue to engage with the civil society, continue to engage with the CSOs, NGOs. So that has also, I think, helped to create awareness, create some sort of accountability, And as Farapa was mentioning, there was success in many cases in Bangladesh in the decentralized at the local level in terms of service delivery, in terms of disaster, in terms of, and we see, I mean, now we talk about, like, how it was successful. Just for an example, now we have flood crisis. So what is happening, there is a huge support, like the fund coming from community, from the people, but the challenge is, like, as the local government institution now is not functional, because after the, like, not functional, I would say that it's mostly not functional because of the political crisis that we had, and some of the changes in laws after this interim government took place. So um, then we see that some chaotic situation in the flood relief. So that's where we can see, we can tell that this local governance system, whatever we had, it was, in many ways it was successful. And then we can see that crisis, and also coming to the interim government now. For me, I see there might be a big challenge to in terms of the decentralization process, local governance process, because there is also a lot of unclarity now, because we do not yet know the roadmap of the interim government, how long they will stay, and what is their actual mandate, which areas they will reform. What we recently have seen, that they have changed the 4 or 5 laws related to the local government, and all the elected board chair of municipality was elaboration, and they are gone now. They, I mean, that was cancelled. So, and again, it has given.
Sorry, start wrapping up. Sorry about that.
Okay. So I'll wrap up soon. So those vacuum, and also giving that authority to the administration technocrat, then again can become a bad example as well. So that's my fear. That's why when it comes to the point that how we support this whole movement, this whole youth, on reshaping the country, restructuring the country. These are something that I think we need to be really careful, cautious about how we orient them, because with this huge youth success, we also, just after the momentum after this, we also have seen noticing different alarming situation. So because you see, these youth they are not like they have some sort of a lack of awareness on human rights, inclusivity. Those are the things, and this is somewhere actually probably there's we all need to support these groups, like when it comes to, and that point. I see Farapa has raised her hand, but I would say that we need to be careful that the other groups they don't use them as their tools, like to regain their power, or like the misuse or abuse of those student spirit, the true spirit, and that kind of alarming elements we are seeing in terms of women's empowerment, gender, and all other issues.
Shireen,
So that is something
do need
we
to
really
hurry
need
up
to
because we are running out of time. Very sorry.
Okay, thank you so much.
No,
I
please.
will stop.
Yes. Farah, we'll just park your question because we do have Mujib and Marcus also waiting to make their very interesting intervention. So we'll come back if, or why don't you, write it in chat if that works better. But I will move to Mujib now. When we are talking about countries in South Asia, like Pakistan, India, Nepal, which have, now a provincial system also, when we are talking about the federal system, is decentralization of budgets in danger of being co-opted even more by the larger governments, at the various levels? And what implications would this have for fiscal federalization? Because, as Rahul said, you're talking about own revenue mobilization, but that also needs to be supplemented by the decentralization that happens due to transfers. What's your experience of this, Mujib? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll borrow Rahul's phrase, devolution for thee and not for me. I think that is writ large in everything that happens. I think, we have heard about the higher tier of government being more interested in devolution at the expense of the middle tier of the government. And when it comes to the middle tier of the government, that actually have to legislate for the local governments to come into existence, and they are obviously more reluctant. Fiscal decentralization obviously is the essence of things, because that's what will make what will ensure delivery of services. And that is precisely the reason why, particularly in the case of Pakistan, we witness a very solid pattern. So we have had local governments when there were military governments, but we have had very weak local governments or non-existent local governments when there were political governments. And there are all sorts of ways of dealing with them. Typically, the provinces constitute finance commissions that share resources between the provincial level, and I'm not now talking of the between the federation and the province, because there is a similar game that goes on, and the federation tries to minimize the share of the provinces. Obviously, the debate there is a bit more formal, structured, and the rights are established in a more concrete manner. But when it comes to the local governments, typically the what we have observed in Pakistani experience is that they have tried to, for instance, tinker with the composition of the finance commission, because you have to have some representation from the local government. So the decision-making rules are such that it's the province that ends up getting its way, and then that is how they try to reduce the share that goes to the local governments. And then within that, there are other ways. For instance, I gave you an example of health and education being carved out of the local government system altogether. So which means this is a different way of actually minimizing or reducing the share that actually goes to them. Another example is, for instance, the revenue assignment. They don't actually are not willing to part ways with the authority to levy taxes. And property tax is an example, which is a local tax, but typically in Pakistani case, it's levied by the province. In one of the provinces, the cost of levying the tax is actually more than the revenue that they actually recover from but still the province insists that they must not lose control of that. Again, since you have to decentralize, or you have to have this fiscal decentralization, there are ways of again dealing with that. Some provinces have actually developed elaborate formulas that only cover the current side of the budget, whereas others that have done it only for the development side. Obviously, it makes more sense if it's because current, you have a certain establishment, costs are to be paid, so that budget must go to the local governments. But when it comes to the development, the formulas are then managed in a particular manner. I'm sorry, I'm giving the negative picture, but that is, obviously, while it's a desirable outcome to have local governance and local effective and empowered local government, but the desire typically is missing there. And even if you have it in the formula, in some extreme examples, the funds are actually not devolved at all. So there is simply the law is not followed, and then there are cases that are happening in courts of laws with to no major effect. So while it's all very desirable, I think in our experience in the case of Pakistan, there has been a not very covert effort by the provincial level or the state level to reduce the authority at the local government level. And one of the instruments of accomplishing that is the fiscal decentralization.
Sorry, Mujib, you went on mute. Did you finish what you were going to say?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Yeah, essentially, the essence of my argument was, yes, the local government revenue is at the risk of, being poached upon by the higher levels of government. I think the solution probably might lie in having, in having constitutional provisions, which ensure that the funds are actually funds do go over there. Typically, in our example, the local own source revenue is just 5%. 95% comes from the province, and the province doesn't give them. Then obviously there is no service delivery, and that happens through the deconcentrated parallel delivery mechanism.
Thank you. We will bring in Marcus here. And, to Marcus, my question is really going to be about the almost sort of grassroots eminence of, local government institutions coming up informally. I'd also like to bring in, the Nepal experience here. Now, when we're talking decentralization, we tend to talk a lot about local self-government, but the interesting issue in Nepal has been, it's been a highly centralized country. It might be a country of just under 30 million, but hugely complex, very diverse, not just in terms of geography, but in terms of ethnicity, language. It's not as homogeneous as people make it out to be. So it's complex to govern. That's very obvious. And the federalization, the new federal constitution, 3 spheres has been extremely important. But in Nepal, this also includes the provincial government. And where does a provincial government fit in? And here, Nepal has absolutely no historical legacy of the provincial government. It's always had a very strong federal government. Historically, it's been very, very strong. And that's only been a positive for the country at the local level with the Panchayati era, with other local mobilizations like community forest management. So these have been legacy institutions that the local spheres of government have been able to use or map onto. Now, existing institutional overhangs can also have a negative function, but this is also something that you can work with. The other interesting question in Nepal is, where do the provinces fit in? Because for some things to be delivered at scale, I did notice this intervention here on COVID-19, and absolutely some local governments did spectacularly well. But from other instances across South Asia, provincial capitals and provincial governments have also had a mediating role to play in terms of the coordination, or let's say in terms of SME development. You would need the provincial governments to work in tandem with the local governments as important. But the point of Myanmar, Marcus, is very different from the Nepal example, where you did have very well-formed local institutions, certainly informal and now also formal, backed with the new federal constitution. But it seems to me, from what you said, in Myanmar, we are looking at it from the grassroots. You're looking at it as some kind of community governance, units providing services under the provision of the resistance forces. So, as an example of organic grassroots local government, can this actually have any sort of lesson for the rest of the subcontinent, or indeed any learners and practitioners of decentralization? Over to you, Marcus. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing up this interesting link between Myanmar and Nepal. I am lucky to have had some experience myself working in Nepal between 2007 and 11 during the constitution building period. And at that time, I was quite involved in discussions on the role of local government in the constitution and all of that. And I also took a group of Myanmar leaders to Nepal last year on a study visit to study the workings of local government under the new constitution. And the people from Myanmar found that very, very interesting. And I know from my Nepali friends that there are many things that are not quite working as people expect they should. But I think in the big picture, both in terms of the possible trajectories 15 years ago in Nepal, but also globally speaking, there are not that many successful constitutional transformation processes of the type of Nepal that have so much to show. And especially the constitutionalization of local government as a third tier with direct constitutional powers and authorities and resources. And also the focus of the affirmative action arrangements at the local level, from quotas to both in terms of identity, ethnicity, but also women, that has, in a way, addressed a lot of the grievances that were the engine, the driving force behind the call for federalism, and in particular ethnic federalism 15 years ago. And in a way, because a lot of that has been picked up by the local government, the provinces have somehow found themselves a bit on a wrong track, or a bit sort of as almost redundant element in the eyes of some, because they realized that, actually a lot of what the provinces were claiming from the center to be done is actually already taken care of by the local level, to simplify now. And I think that in itself is a very interesting learning for the people in Myanmar, because in the Myanmar context, the call for federalism has been driven very much by ethnic minority elites that see the problem lying at the center of the country, in Naypyidaw, but have not really paid much attention to how to build local government that would then also reflect the extreme diversity of the population at the local level. Because one of the big challenges in Nepal was if you build ethnic federalism on the basis of which ethnic identities and what would be the role of groups that wouldn't have their own state, that would be minorities within minorities, and how many ethnicities could claim their own state and things like that. And that is very much a discussion that Myanmar is in right now. And it is exactly now that this question can be injected so what is the role of local government? Because ultimately what it is about is reconfiguring a relationship between the state and the people and making the state actually serve the people. And that can best be done, or at least to a large extent, through effective local government that is enabled by a legal constitutional framework, well-funded and equipped, but also embedded in a larger effective state cooperative system. And I think we see features of that emerging in Nepal. And that's why I believe it is a relevant example for Myanmar. But in Myanmar, we're still at the very beginning of a lot of this. What we see in Myanmar is what some, I think, euphemistically call rebel governance, which is essentially what ethnic armed organizations that have spent decades fighting against the state, who are now claiming that they are providing services to the local population, but which is true, but is very selective and is not really of the type of what would deserve to be called local government in other contexts. And so the big question really is on how to transform. And these entities, control, as I said, like maybe a third of the country by now, control and claim to govern and administer. But what does that really mean? And in terms of, inclusion, in terms of accountability, in terms of rule of law, and in terms of building some sort of continuity with the previous state system. Because one big challenge every revolution has, and I think we will see this also now in Bangladesh, is what level of compromise do you make with the previous regime, and what do you throw over and start new, and where do you start, what parts of the old regime, of the old system, of the incumbent structures do you take over and continue to use? And in Nepal, we have seen a very strong continuity of previous structures and systems. There was never a situation where the existence of Nepal as a country was questioned. But that is where we find ourselves in Myanmar right now, where the opposition against the military that has instrumentalized and weaponized the state against the people is actually as an effort. So the question is whether it's an effort to destroy the militarized state, or is it an effort to liberate the state and democratize it and decentralize it? And that is where we find ourselves at the moment in the debate in Myanmar. Unfortunately, there are not that many people who are familiar with the language of decentralization and local government and things like that, because as I said, Myanmar was pretty much outside of that discourse for decades. But it is important that we, as also the international community, trying to assist Myanmar to get back on its feet, put attention to this issue and learn lessons as much as possible from other countries in the region.
Thank you, Marcus. Fascinating contrast there between Myanmar and Nepal, but with lessons for the rest of the subcontinent too. I know we've run out of time, but is there any one burning question that you think you don't want to put on chat and put it out there, and we can throw it open? In the interest of time, I am going to count to 10 to see if there is that one burning question and one hand up. even among our panelists to each other, but countdown happening quite fast. I am guessing not, but I haven't followed it all. There's been some fascinating back and forth in the chat section. We've had a very, very involved audience here. Thank you to all our panelists for bringing in these perspectives. These are not only just rooted to the local context that you work in, and when I say local context, these are not tiny local contexts. These are huge local contexts with ramifications for policy and developmental outcomes on billions and millions of people. And also replicability across the subcontinent into larger debates and discussions on decentralization. But I think at the heart of it remains, what is effective decentralization? When do people start feeling empowered? And what role can donors play over there in nudging it? Because at the end of the day, donors are outsiders. These are processes that have to be, in the end, the agency has to come from citizens, from leaders, from within those communities. And that's what we take away from there. There are many ways of doing this, many ways of answering these debates, and maybe Madhavi and Lima can convene part 2, and we can take some of the interesting questions thrown forward further. But thank you once again for taking your time. And Madhavi, over to you very quickly.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. Just to say a huge thank you to our panelists for all the time, for staying back. Also to the audience, for a really engaged audience today. I think we've seen a lot of interesting patterns in the region, whether it is strong legislative and policy provisions on paper, but not always in practice. The questions of effective decentralization, what that means, as you pointed out, Pallavi, but also the rise of informal systems, military regimes, and technology being that one binding factor, and how that's influencing decentralization. I do hope we can keep these conversations going. Do stay engaged with LPSA. Our next session will be on December 3rd, and you're most welcome to contribute with ideas, thoughts on shaping that discussion. And we hope you found it useful. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.